I saw it before he did, and it changed everything. The rain outside tapped against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the bustling Manhattan restaurant like a soft drumbeat, merging with the clatter of silverware and muted chatter of wealthy patrons. Hannah Bennett adjusted her black apron, knuckles white against the polished tray as she navigated the crowded floor, her heart thudding with the same rhythm as the storm outside. The golden glow from the chandeliers above reflected off crystal glasses she carried, each step careful, measured, yet hurried. She noticed the faint scuff on the polished marble near the entrance, something barely out of place, a slip of shadow cast by the low lighting that shouldn't have been there. Something about it pulled her gaze, a whisper of wrongness that made her pause mid-step, and in that instant, the world shifted. Dominic Marino entered, tall, his presence commanding the room without a word, tailored black suit impeccable even in the rain-spattered foyer, eyes sharp, scanning, aware. The chatter dinned around him, the subtle hum of authority pressing into the corners of the space. As he approached the main dining area, Hannah's pulse raced, but her fingers clenched the tray tighter, hiding the tremor that ran along her arms. Her breath caught as he passed by, and she caught a glimpse of something, an envelope left carelessly on the host's podium, a corner peeking from beneath the polished wood, something that didn't belong. Her mind raced, the pattern clear in a flash, and when Dominic spoke to the restaurant manager, his words cut through the room like steel, yet faltered for a split second as his gaze flicked toward her, aware now, noticing that she had seen more than she should. Time stretched thin, her heartbeat was loud in her ears. She adjusted the tray with a subtle tilt, masking the way her eyes tracked every slight movement he made, every calculated step. The orchestra of the restaurant's activity continued, yet the storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath, mirroring the sudden tension between observation and authority. Dominic's lips parted, forming words, then froze, a hesitation that no one else caught, but that Hannah felt like a jolt to her chest. He hadn't stumbled, hadn't faltered, but something in the tilt of his head, the slight narrowing of his eyes, betrayed a recognition, an acknowledgment of her perception. She swallowed hard, keeping her stance firm, steady, as though the tray itself were an extension of her resolve, a shield between him and the chaos that might erupt unnoticed. Every second expanded, the air thick with unspoken calculations, each step she took measured yet natural, as if dancing along the edge of revelation. Dominic exhaled slowly, a controlled, almost imperceptible shift that signaled he was aware, considering, adjusting, yet still in command. Hannah's small detail had become a pivot point, invisible to anyone else, but it reshaped the flow of the moment entirely. A subtle nod, almost imperceptible, passed between her mind and his perception, the weight of knowing without speaking pressing between them. And as she continued through the room, the tray balanced perfectly, her hand steady despite the rapid thump of adrenaline in her chest, she realized the storm outside, the glittering chandeliers, the murmurs of affluent voices, all of it had condensed into a single point of tension where observation could alter influence, and she held that point in the careful poise of her movements, unseen yet undeniable, until Dominic Marino moved on, but not before the slight crease in his brow told her he remembered, and she had changed something he hadn't expected, had shifted a subtle current in the river of power that ran through the room, all while keeping the fragile balance of normalcy intact, her breath quiet, her stance deliberate, her mind sharp, eyes locked on the flow of the dining hall, knowing she had been seen, yet unexposed, holding the space between vulnerability and influence in that suspended heartbeat. Hannah moved deeper into the dining area, each careful step measured against the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of cutlery, the tray steady in her hands despite the rapid beat of her heart. The rain outside had intensified, sheets of water cascading against the windows and streaking the light from the chandeliers in golden shards across the marble floors. Her green eye scanned the room, alert to every detail, the small shadow she had noticed earlier still vivid in her mind, and she adjusted her stance, subtly shifting weight to maintain balance as she navigated between tables. Dominic Marino remained near the center of the room, his presence a silent force, aura radiating authority, the black suit impeccably tailored, his polished shoes reflecting faint glimmers of light from the chandeliers, eye scanning, analyzing, not missing a single movement in the room. Hannah felt a tension curl through her chest, a mix of anticipation and cautious focus, as she approached a table where a glass had been placed slightly askew, noticing a small smudge of condensation that threatened to slide. She tilted the tray, catching the subtle imbalance, her fingers pressing gently against the rim of the crystal, keeping it level, a quiet testament to her attentiveness. Dominic's gaze followed her movements, the slight narrowing of his eyes suggesting awareness, the faintest shift in expression that hinted he recognized the precision, the care, and the alertness that had gone unnoticed by anyone else in the room. The air between them was taut, electric, a silent conversation of perception and control, Hannah aware of being observed yet moving with confidence, every motion deliberate, measured, a blend of necessity and instinct. A waiter passed by carrying a heavy plate of appetizers, and Hannah timed her step perfectly, sidestepping the passing tray with ease, avoiding a collision, while her peripheral vision caught Dominic's subtle nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to communicate recognition, acknowledgment, a fleeting approval of her awareness and composure under pressure. She continued through the restaurant, tray steady, steps quiet, yet every movement calculated, anticipating, observing, the small details that could unravel a moment of disorder before it occurred. Dominic shifted slightly, the faintest lean forward, gaze tracing her path, noting the efficiency in her motion, the confidence in her stance despite the subtle tremor of adrenaline, and Hannah felt the balance of power. Subtly shift, not with words, not with confrontation, but through observation, calculation, and awareness. She reached the far end of the dining floor, placing the last glasses gently, aligning each crystal with precise care, breathing slowly to calm the adrenaline that had spiked as the silent exchange unfolded. Dominic's eyes followed her every action, silent, controlled, and in that stillness, Hannah recognized a subtle shift, a mutual acknowledgment of competence, of awareness, and the unspoken understanding that in a room full of distraction and movement, the small details, the careful attention, had become the defining moment of perception and influence, shaping the silent dance between observation and authority that would set the tone for the rest of the evening. Hannah carried the tray toward the back of the restaurant, moving with a rhythm that had become instinctive, muscles tuned to anticipate every step, every sway of the floorboards beneath the polished marble. The rain had slowed outside, but the clouds still poured a grey light into the space, washing the room in a muted silver glow that made the chandeliers seem even warmer, the reflections on the glasses and polished surfaces more vivid. Dominic remained near the center of the room, a still presence, observing quietly, his dark eyes following her movements without a single word, each glance calculated, noting the subtle interplay between her awareness and her careful execution. She reached a table with a slight wobble in the chairs, adjusting them imperceptibly while maintaining the balance of the tray, a small detail that kept the service seamless, and Dominic's gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, recognition flickering in the curve of his jaw, the tilt of his head. A guest accidentally dropped a silver spoon, its soft clink cutting through the room for a moment, and Hannah's eyes snapped to the source, catching it mid-slide with a gentle tilt of her wrist, restoring the order before anyone noticed the potential mishap. She straightened, breath steady, pulse under control, aware of every micro-movement in the room, from the flicker of a napkin to the placement of a chair, the soft shuffle of a server passing behind her. Dominic moved slightly, shifting weight from one foot to the other, his hand brushing against a chair as he passed, not touching her directly, yet his presence a tangible force, the subtle cues in his posture speaking volumes, a silent dialogue of awareness and command. Hannah adjusted the tray again, the crystal glasses balanced, reflections catching the faint chandelier light, and she sensed him lean slightly forward, almost imperceptible, acknowledging her attentiveness, the way she had seen, noticed, and acted upon the smallest details. Her heart ticked steadily, adrenaline mingling with focus, every nerve alert, and the room seemed to contract around the two of them, a bubble of awareness where ordinary activity met unspoken scrutiny. She placed the last glass carefully, leveling it against the others, eyes flicking toward Dominic, noting the slight raise of an eyebrow, the faint shift in posture that marked his recognition without intrusion. The air was charged but calm, the unspoken understanding between them a thread of control and observation weaving through the dining room. Hannah moved away, steps measured, tray empty, yet the tension lingered, Dominic's gaze following, assessing, aware of the subtle competence displayed, a silent acknowledgement that in this room full of motion and attention, the quiet, deliberate actions of a single individual could alter the perception of order, influence, and control. Every movement she made after that seemed to carry weight, each step a careful negotiation with space, awareness, and authority, a ballet of perception, where observation became power, and every glance exchanged held the potential to reshape the atmosphere without a single word spoken. Hannah stepped back toward the open kitchen, tray empty now but posture rigid, eyes constantly scanning, noting the flow of servers, the subtle shifts of guests, the way a chair had been nudged too far from the table, the tilt of a wine glass catching the chandelier light in a momentary glare. Dominic had moved toward the entrance, yet his presence seemed to linger, a quiet force pressing on the edges of the room, his eyes tracking her in small, precise intervals, measuring, analyzing, his expression controlled but attentive. She paused briefly to adjust her hair, tucking a stray strand behind her ear, the motion natural but deliberate, aware that every small action had weight, and her green eyes flicked to the corner where the faint scuff had first drawn her attention. A subtle shift in Dominic's stance caught her notice, the tilt of his head, a slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, and Hannah felt the pulse of connection, unspoken yet undeniable, between observer and observed. The chatter in the room continued, low and unobtrusive, but each sound seemed magnified in the focus that had settled between them, the clink of cutlery, the faint scrape of a chair, the whisper of a server's shoe against the polished floor. She moved toward a table near the window, placing a small plate of desserts with careful precision, aligning edges, tilting slightly to prevent wobble, a microcosm of control and attention that seemed to resonate outward, reaching Dominic even as he stood several feet away, maintaining distance yet never letting her actions escape notice. A guest adjusted a chair, inadvertently nudging a napkin toward the floor, and Hannah bent just enough to restore it without a sound, her breath measured, pulse steady, aware of the silent evaluation unfolding across the room. Dominic's hand brushed lightly against a railing as he passed, a gesture so minimal it could have been overlooked, yet it carried weight, a signal of observation, of consideration, a quiet acknowledgment of competence and awareness. Hannah felt a subtle thrill of understanding, the interplay of attention, awareness, and silent communication weaving an intricate thread through the space, binding the two of them in a shared perception that existed without words. She continued to move with deliberate care, each step precise, body poised, tray steady, eyes sharp, capturing the nuances of light, shadow, and human movement that might escape anyone else, aware that in the ballet of service and scrutiny, she was no longer merely a participant, but an active influence on the room's flow. Dominic's gaze lingered, noting the efficiency, the care, the small yet significant decisions made instinctively, and Hannah felt a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that her attentiveness had altered the rhythm of the moment, the tension between awareness and authority settling into a dynamic of mutual respect, silent yet powerful, shaping the remainder of the evening with each subtle, purposeful gesture she made. Hannah adjusted the final setting on the table near the corner, straightening glasses and aligning silverware with meticulous care, her eyes flicking up momentarily to observe Dominic as he moved toward the entrance, still a commanding presence, the soft hum of conversation flowing around him yet unable to mask the subtle authority he carried. The lighting from the chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floors in golden patterns, casting a warm glow over the room, and the rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, leaving streaks of silver along the windows. She noticed a small crease in a napkin that had been overlooked, bent slightly at the edge, and bent to correct it, fingers steady, her movements precise, careful, demonstrating an attentiveness that Dominic's eyes immediately registered, though his expression remained composed. Patrons shifted slightly in their seats, unaware of the silent tension weaving through the air between the two, the faintest acknowledgment passing in a glance, a recognition of competence without a single word exchanged. A server passed behind her carrying a tray of appetizers, and Hannah adjusted her own steps, shifting her weight to prevent any interference, a microcosm of controlled motion that dominated the immediate space and maintained the seamless flow of service. Dominic's gaze followed her with a deliberate steadiness, noting every subtle adjustment, the way her eyes caught details, the balance of her stance, the measured confidence in her actions despite the underlying rhythm of fatigue and focus. Hannah's pulse was steady, breath measured, as she continued to move between tables, aligning items, straightening placements, adjusting angles, each motion contributing to an overall harmony that seemed to ripple outward, subtly influencing the perception of order throughout the dining area. The soft clink of a glass from another table drew her attention, and she moved with practiced precision to adjust it, her hand steady, the movement almost imperceptible to the patrons but clear in its intent, signaling an acute awareness and control over her environment. Dominic took a small step closer, the faintest motion, unassuming yet deliberate, the way his body oriented toward her signaling observation, evaluation, and acknowledgment of the subtle mastery of her movements. Hannah felt a quiet confidence bloom within her, the awareness that her attention to detail had shifted the balance, creating an unspoken connection of recognition and mutual assessment. Each step she took, each slight adjustment, resonated with an undercurrent of influence, Dominic's eyes tracking, registering, the silent dialogue between them deepening, the room around them humming with the ongoing rhythm of service, movement, and attention, every small detail amplified in significance, every gesture measured, deliberate, creating a dynamic of control, awareness, and subtle power that had quietly shifted the tone of the evening and set the stage for what was to unfold in the hours to come. Hannah paused near the corner of the dining room, taking a moment to steady her breathing, the soft murmur of conversation around her a steady backdrop to the focused awareness that had settled over her since Dominic had first entered. Her green eyes scanned the room once more, noting the subtle misalignments in chairs, the slight shifts of trays, the glint of light on crystal glasses, and the way the silverware reflected the golden glow of the chandeliers. She adjusted her stance, tray in hand, ready to move, yet holding the poise of someone aware of every micro-movement around her. Dominic had moved to the far end of the room, near the entrance to the private dining section, but his presence was a quiet gravitational pull, the aura of authority undiminished, his eyes tracking her through brief glimpses, noting her attentiveness, her precision, the deliberate way she moved between tables. A server nudged a plate slightly too close to the edge of a table, and Hannah reached out with the gentlest tilt, catching it before any disruption occurred, her fingers steady, her posture controlled, a small intervention that went unnoticed by anyone else but registered fully in Dominic's gaze. The subtle acknowledgment, the quiet exchange of recognition, lingered in the air between them, a silent communication that neither words nor gestures could fully capture. Hannah moved toward the dessert station, adjusting a tray of delicate pastries, aligning them with meticulous care, and in that brief interval, Dominic's head tilted slightly, the faintest crease in his brow suggesting awareness, interest, and the recognition of skill and presence that had been demonstrated quietly, yet powerfully. She continued to weave through the room, eyes sharp, movements deliberate, every action measured, a rhythm that maintained the flow of service while highlighting the keen awareness she had cultivated, the ability to observe and act with precision, the subtle intelligence in anticipating potential disturbances before they arose. The lighting caught the edges of her hair and the soft folds of her uniform, shadows dancing lightly across the marble floor, and she adjusted her step to account for the reflection, tilting the tray just enough to compensate, a micro-correction that could have been invisible to anyone else, but to Dominic, it was an unspoken display of capability and composure under pressure. A glass near the center table wobbled slightly, and she leaned in just enough to steady it, her hand firm, her gaze calm, maintaining the delicate balance of the dining floor, and Dominic's eyes followed her every motion, noting the competence, the awareness, and the subtle power in restraint. The room around them hummed with activity, yet the space between Hannah and Dominic seemed to pulse with a quiet tension, each small movement an unspoken test, a silent negotiation of influence and perception, awareness and control. She moved again, steps measured, tray poised, each micro-motion deliberate, maintaining equilibrium, and Dominic's presence lingered, keenly observing, a silent acknowledgment of the effectiveness, the attentiveness, and the quiet authority she had demonstrated through precision, awareness, and the careful orchestration of her actions across the dining floor. Hannah paused near the edge of the private dining area, tray in hand, feeling the subtle shift in the atmosphere as Dominic moved closer, each step deliberate, the soft click of his shoes against the polished marble drawing her attention without a word being spoken. The lighting cast a warm glow across the room, highlighting the careful arrangement she had made, the gleam of crystal glasses, the precise alignment of silverware, and the small, nearly imperceptible details that had drawn Dominic's notice in the first place. She adjusted her grip on the tray, fingers steady despite the undercurrent of adrenaline, and continued moving through the space, eyes sharp, scanning the room, observing not only the patrons but the slight changes in the posture of Dominic as he surveyed her actions. A server brushed past her, carrying a plate of hors d'oeuvres, and she shifted slightly, balancing the tray to maintain perfect alignment, her motions fluid, precise, and controlled, demonstrating her awareness and command over the immediate environment. Dominic's gaze followed her, unwavering yet subtle, noting each micro-adjustment, the careful tilt of a glass, the minor repositioning of a chair, the exact spacing between utensils, and the way her eyes flicked to each small detail, assessing, anticipating, correcting. The faintest exhale of breath escaped her lips as she straightened another glass, and in that instant, Dominic's posture seemed to soften, a slight lean forward suggesting recognition, a silent acknowledgment of competence and careful observation that resonated across the room. The murmurs of patrons, the gentle clinking of cutlery, and the distant hum of conversation faded into a background rhythm against the pulse of awareness that had settled between them. Hannah moved toward the center of the room, careful not to disrupt any service, maintaining her composure, every movement deliberate, each step measured, the tray balanced, the lighting catching the angles of her uniform and the reflections from the crystal with precision. Dominic's eyes followed her in silence, registering, evaluating, the small crease in his expression, the subtle tightening of his jaw, all telling her that her attention to detail had not gone unnoticed. She adjusted her stance, a micro-movement, tilting the tray just slightly to compensate for the uneven floorboards beneath her feet, maintaining perfect balance, and Dominic's lips parted momentarily, not in speech but in recognition of her precision, the quiet influence she exerted over the room through her deliberate, careful actions. Hannah felt a sense of quiet control, the awareness that each small adjustment, each micro-decision, carried weight and could influence the perception of order and efficiency within the room. The soft ambient sounds, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clatter of glass, all faded as she navigated through the dining area, every action precise, every glance intentional, her attentiveness shaping the flow and tone of the space. Dominic moved slightly, an almost imperceptible shift, a subtle nod of acknowledgment, the faintest indication that he had registered the skill, awareness, and subtle authority she exercised, and Hannah continued, poised, steady, aware that in these small, deliberate motions she held influence, and that Dominic, despite his commanding presence, had recognized it fully, the silent understanding between them strengthening with every measured step, every careful adjustment, every mindful glance. She offered across the room. Hannah moved with deliberate care toward the main dining floor once again, tray empty, hands relaxed but poised, each step measured as if she were walking a tightrope over invisible tension. The ambient lighting reflected off polished marble and crystal, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the space as the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle. Dominic had shifted slightly toward the center of the room, yet his presence remained a quiet force, eyes tracing her movements, registering every subtle adjustment, the tilt of her tray, the way she angled a glass to catch the light, the slight realignment of a chair that threatened to wobble. Hannah's breath was steady, pulse rhythmic, every muscle aware, every movement intentional, a testament to her attention and adaptability, the quiet authority in her actions growing more apparent as the evening unfolded. A small misalignment in the cutlery caught her attention, and she adjusted it with a gentle, precise motion, tilting the tray to compensate for a subtle dip in the marble, ensuring balance and symmetry, the faint sound of silver against crystal almost lost in the ambient hum of conversation. Dominic's eyes followed her, not in a threatening manner but with recognition, the slight narrowing of his gaze, the subtle shift in his posture, acknowledging the competence and awareness that had become increasingly clear in her movements. Hannah's eyes flicked to the edge of the room, noting the flow of servers and guests, each micro-interaction observed, anticipating potential disruptions and correcting them before they could impact the harmony of the dining experience. Every breath, every tilt of her wrist, every careful adjustment was observed, a silent dialogue of awareness, precision, and influence flowing between her and Dominic, an unspoken acknowledgment of skill, composure, and subtle command of the space. The room continued to buzz with activity, yet a thread of quiet tension persisted, a dynamic of observation and recognition that hummed in the air, tangible yet invisible, as Hannah continued to move with balance, poise, and focus, maintaining a perfect rhythm between attentiveness and action. Dominic shifted slightly again, a measured lean, a subtle indication that he recognized her mastery of movement, her ability to manage the flow of the dining room, and the silent impact of her presence, her awareness shaping the atmosphere around them. Hannah felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing her attention to detail, her control over micro-moments, and her precise execution had established a connection, a shared understanding of observation and influence that resonated between them, and as she moved toward the far end of the room, every step deliberate, every motion intentional, the soft reflections of chandelier light on crystal glasses, silverware, and polished marble reinforced the delicate balance of presence, control, an unspoken communication that had quietly come to define the space between her and Dominic, each aware of the other, each influencing the flow and perception of the evening with the smallest, most deliberate gestures, until the subtle acknowledgement of competence and awareness had shaped the room in ways neither had needed to speak aloud. Hannah took a slow breath, her fingers lingering on the empty tray as she paused near the center of the dining floor, the subtle hum of conversation fading into a soft backdrop as the focus between her and Dominic tightened like a drawn thread. The chandeliers above shimmered, casting a gentle glow that reflected in the crystal and silverware, highlighting the meticulous care she had taken with each placement, each adjustment, each micro-movement that had gone unnoticed by everyone but him. Dominic had stopped mid-step, a slight lean forward, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in acknowledgement, the faintest curve at the corner of his lips suggesting recognition of her precision, awareness, and quiet command of her space. She moved toward a side table, placing an untouched glass back into perfect alignment, adjusting the silverware so that the angles matched the other settings across the room, her green eyes flicking to Dominic with measured awareness, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the gentle exhale that seemed to signal approval, and she felt a quiet pulse of connection, a silent understanding of competence and perception exchanged without a single word. A server passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and she timed her step perfectly, moving with grace, tilting the tray with ease, keeping balance and poise as her gaze caught the smallest hint of misalignment in the plates and glasses, correcting them with a gentle touch, her movements fluid, practiced, and precise. Dominic observed, every glance meticulous, noting the finesse, the attentiveness, the way she managed the room with subtle influence, the quiet authority that came from observation, anticipation, and thoughtful action. Hannah felt her awareness sharpen further, sensing the space between them, the silent thread of acknowledgement that had formed, her body poised, breathing steady, pulse calm yet alert, every step deliberate, every adjustment intentional, and she knew the effect of her actions extended beyond the physical, shaping perception, flow, and harmony across the dining floor. Dominic shifted slightly, the faintest nod, a subtle recognition of the skill, composure, and careful observation she had displayed consistently throughout the evening, and Hannah felt a quiet affirmation, the unspoken acknowledgement that her attentiveness had left an imprint, a thread of influence, a silent, shared understanding of control and awareness. She continued through the room with steady poise, eyes sweeping across tables and patrons, every movement considered, every micro-adjustment precise, the soft reflections of light and shadow emphasizing the care, focus, and balance she maintained. Dominic's gaze followed her, unwavering, registering the competence, the deliberate awareness, and the quiet impact she had on the space around them, each step, each tilt, each careful motion reinforcing the connection that had silently formed, until the room seemed to breathe in tandem with them, every action purposeful, every glance intentional, and the atmosphere itself held the quiet, electric tension of mutual recognition, respect, and unspoken understanding, the evening forever marked by the subtle influence of attentiveness, observation, and precision that Hannah had brought to life in the space they shared.